In the months following the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, Black Lives Matter protests erupted in countries around the globe. While an inspiring glimpse into what international solidarity could look like, it also drew back the curtain on the willingness of supposedly democratic and civil governments to employ brutal repression.
In Philadelphia, an officer uses pepper spray on civilians who are clearly not resisting. While here in Los Angeles, we see officers escalating a standoff, firing hundreds of less lethal rounds at retreating protesters, including attacking civilians on private property.
Go inside now! Get in the hell!
Here in Portland, a similar anonymity has given federal agents license to operate like secret police.
What is going on? Who are you?
Abductions like these are not the only instances of Portland's residents being subjected to authoritarian violence by unaccountable federal agents.
Please don't shoot us!
For many, seeing images of this kind of violence being extracted on people who looked and sounded like them was a first, and was evident in the sudden realization by many of the unfettered power of the neoliberal state. It should be noted that this kind of violence has been a lived experience for minorities everywhere, but the wall-to-wall media coverage on mainstream media was a first. This culminated in the mainstreaming of many anarchist notions such as ACAB and abolishing or defunding the police. The speed at which these concepts spread and the ease by which they were assimilated into people's worldview underscored the tenuous grasp that neoliberalism had upon society. In her book 5 Essays for Freedom, Christy Alger posits that neoliberalism is the political ideology of free market capitalism associated with the privatization of public institutions, the deregulation of industries, and the globalization of markets via free trade agreements. It is also associated with cost-saving austerity measures that undermine social welfare and result in the commercialization of poverty and inequality. Neoliberal government policy is designed to create the market environments necessary for industry and corporations to flourish and promotes the manifestly fallacious notion of trickle-down economics. In this sense, most countries' major political parties, whether billed as left or right-wing, are fundamentally neoliberal. And because of the continuing prominence given to the creating and sustaining of markets within a country's economy, the real power that governments have over fiscal policy is becoming smaller and smaller. This has given rise to the belief from large amounts of the population that both sides of politics are fundamentally the same, and by identifying the increasingly limited scope of elected governments to implement meaningful public policy, this can be seen as relatively true. It is for these reasons that both the left and the right were of almost one mind in their rejection of these anarchist notions of ACAB and abolish defund the police. Policing is a function of the state's executive power, ensuring compliance not only with legislation enacted by the state, but with the very notion of the state itself. For the state to remain legitimate, it has to be the only available option. Alternatives to the state are a direct threat to its very existence, and this is why you will see seemingly harmless activities such as living off-grid or setting up autonomous communities or even setting up food programs to feed the unhomed or those at risk so severely repressed by the state. Ordinary people might ask, how does one person living outside the strictures of broader society harm anyone else? A perfectly rational thing to believe, but of course, the mere fact that they are attempting to operate outside the system establishes them as a threat to the system. This experience has long been a reality for marginalized groups, and Black anarchism has more than a century of theory and activism behind it. As Ashanti Alston explained, Black culture has always been oppositional and is all about finding ways to creatively resist oppression here in the most racist country in the world. So when I speak of a Black anarchism, it is not so tied to the colour of my skin, but who I am as a person, as someone who can resist, who can see differently when I am stuck and thus live differently. Likewise, the types of state oppression seen in the US in 2020 have been exported to the global south for decades. This has been resisted by many anarchist groups around the globe, notably in South America, where the tendrils of US imperialism have long caused harm. Returning now to the Black Lives Matter protests, with this understanding of the state and its function, we can easily see why such a groundswell of radical change was such a threat to the neoliberal state. I use radical here in the political sense and in opposition to the state's mostly powerless mechanisms of reform. As Brian Kastner, Senior Crisis Advisor on Arms and Military Operations at Amnesty International, points out, the analysis is clear. When activists and supporters of the Black Lives Matter movement took to the streets in cities and towns across the USA to peacefully demand an end to systemic racism and police violence, they were overwhelmingly met with a militarized response and more police violence. Despite the multi-varied nature of the protests, this much is clear. The true nature of the state's response was not about law and order, and it wasn't about public safety, but it was about the continuation of the state itself.
If you like what we're doing and want to help out, consider heading on over to patreon.com/onlydogontheleft and supporting us there. We have a few tiers with a few little treats and goodies. And speaking of my wonderful, wonderful patrons, I'd like to thank In Puppy Preschool, Extremely Online Left, and Ben Snow. My guard doggos are Jordan Mark, Ben Davis, and Tristan Hennessy. And to A. Zeitlo, Dangwin, and Jackson Orville, you are very good boys.
They're based on feelings, not facts.
I'm not your gender studies professor who has to cater to your trigger warning, microaggression, safe space bullshit.
Most women are happier at home.
Clean up your room. Organize your local landscape. Schedule your time.
And I have to say that my brain is still in recovery mode from taking in so many high-level important ideas.